Ja, god eftermiddag allesammans. Och varmt välkomna till Timbro. Timbro säger jag. Nu har jag pratat engelska i ett antal timmar så jag börjar få den här sköna svengelskan även när jag pratar mitt eget modersmål. Men så att ni ska vara varmt välkomna hit. Det här är andra året som Timbro står värd för Free Market Roadshow. Och det är en stor ära, måste jag säga, att få välkomna er hit för att få lyssna på en ganska fantastisk samling människor som sitter på både unika kunskaper, erfarenheter och perspektiv från den globala frihetsrörelsen. Vi har med oss en moderator här idag som heter Fredrik Segerfeldt och som ska guida oss igenom hela den här övningen. Men jag tycker att vi ger honom en varm applåd och så får han göra en bättre introduktion av samtliga talare. Välkommen.
I think I'll switch to English then. My name is Fredrik Segerfeldt. I'm the project manager for this and also the moderator. And for those who don't know me, I'm a libertarian writer and commentator and also do some work for Timbro, like organizing this event. And I also want to wish you welcome to tonight's seminar, which is that is co-organized by Timbro, Svensk Tidskrift, and Fria Moderata Studentförbundet. Thank you for that support. We have a great program this evening, or afternoon. I feel like Dave Letterman when I say that. I don't know why. The setup for today's seminar is the following. We have two panels with one introduction for each panel and a discussion after each introduction or main speech, so I should say. And we have a coffee break at 17:15. For those of you who are from the other side of the Atlantic and who have not been to the military, that's 5:15. There's going to be room for questions and answers from the audience after each panel discussion. And we will end a little bit before 7 o'clock, since some of our international guests will have to go to Arlanda to catch a plane. The tour continues. Now, let's go down to business. That is the first panel. In a letter to Jean-Baptiste Leroy, Benjamin Franklin wrote, "In this world nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes." Actually, he was quoting the great 18th century English writer Daniel Defoe, who in another letter had written, "Things as certain as death and taxes can be more firmly believed." This is at least according to Wikipedia. Anyway, death and taxes is the theme of the first panel. And more particularly, we're going to talk about EU tax harmonization and tax havens under siege. In Swedish, we use the term skatteparadis, tax paradise, which I think is a bit misleading. The idea of a haven, of a safe haven, where we're safe from the tax authority, it sounds much nicer and more pertinent to me. Perhaps we should start saying that instead. The main speaker for this panel is Staffan Wennberg, who is Swedish. Until very recently, Staffan was chairman of the World's Taxpayers Association, which is the international equivalent of Skattebetalarnas förening. Before that, among other things, he was a media executive in Scandinavia. Please help me welcome Staffan with an applause.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah? You hear me? Yes. Thank you, Fredrik. I don't think I've ever had my name in such big type before, so thank you especially for that. That's a big welcome. Most of my life I worked in publishing with major European publishing groups like Bonniers, Hachette, Sanoma in Finland, and for a period with Torstar from Canada. And the last 20 years I've been involved in the taxpayers movement, first, as Fredrik said, with the Swedish Taxpayers Organization, and then since I retired with the international taxpayers movement. I've been the chairman the last 2 years and retired from that a month ago. So that's a bit on my background. It seems to me that we have two themes, at least for the first part of our discussion, or perhaps they are intertwined, so we have to talk about the death of the EU and the harmonization of tax havens. The first topic of death and taxes is simple. To tax a person after he is dead might seem more humane than taxing him while he is alive. But it will have him or her worried and planning to minimize the effect for his family or causes long before. So let me be frank. Estate or inheritance taxes are based on some kind of socialist attempt to even out the outcome of life's long efforts when all is said and done. And somehow it does not seem quite fair, and it is also very impractical. Let me give you the Swedish example and my personal example. In the early 90s, my parents wanted to arrange that we 4 children could keep the family summer house in the archipelago after their demise. They did what most did in those days to avoid the gift or estate tax. They signed the house over to us, but not just like that. In return, they got 10 debt notices from each of us. Each debt notice was for the value of the limit you could give as a gift each year. So over 10 years, every Christmas, my parents gave us back one of these 10 notes. So after 10 years, we had no longer a debt to our parents for the house, and we had paid no gift or inheritance tax on the summer house. This was the way a lot of people did it. For larger estates, you could use a more complicated method. You bought an apartment house. The tax value was maybe 30% less than the value of the house. So you borrowed 70%, and you gave it to your children, and you renovated it to increase the value of it. So in this way, you could transfer millions of kroner to the next generation. Then suddenly, in the autumn of 2004, the Swedish socialist government, out of the blue, decided to abolish the estate tax altogether. Everyone was surprised, but the reasons were quite good, actually. The tax receipts were very small, 0.2% of the total taxes they took in. They could quite easily be avoided, as I mentioned in my example. They were paid, and the tax was paid mainly by middle-class homeowners, farmers, and small businesses that then had a difficulty in transferring the business to the next generation. So, and we also had a very publicized case where one of the big inheritors of the Astra pharmaceutical company had an estate tax and a profit tax on the shares when they were sold, and the shares dropped in between. So instead of receiving a number of 100 million kroner, the inheritance were left with a debt of 150 million kroner. And that was not the way they did eventually something to even this out, but from the very big wealth, it was all gone. There are also, as everyone knows, who have had, I was going to say, who has ever died, you know, it's quite expensive in other ways. And other costs to be paid when you die. So many of us wish we could avoid it altogether, but anyway, that's another question for the medical industry. So anyway, so when my parents eventually died at the age of 90 plus, the process was quite quick and simple. We sold the apartment they had for about 35 years, and we had to pay about 22% tax on the profits and on the value increase, and then we divided the money between the 4 of us. So that was quick and simple. And in the wake of the abolishment of the tax of the estate tax in Sweden, life has become easier for small businesses and farmers, families with some savings, and wealthy people like IKEA founder Ingvar Kamprad has returned to Sweden, and some international business people like the chairman of Nordea, Björn Wahlroos, have moved to Sweden, especially as the wealth tax now also is abolished. The last year we had these 2 taxes combined. They accounted for about 0.6% of all the taxes received in Sweden. And the wealth tax had also been fiddled with the government because they wanted people like the H&M owners to stay in Sweden. So if you were a major owner of a big company, your wealth was tax exempt. So it was not very democratic in that ways. But our social democratic government was forward-looking, and this has been part, I think, of the good growth in the liberal development of the Swedish economy. So now I want to just show you a few quick slides of the situation around the world, where we are on this particular slide. Whoops, there we are. Anyway, this is hard to read. Just to show you that, good, that's better. This is the top inheritance estate tax around the world. United States at 40%, and going on down. These are the 19 of the OECD countries that still have this tax. Greece 20, Netherlands, Finland 19, Denmark 15, and so on. Let's see, I can do this myself. 13 countries have repealed inheritance or estate tax since 2000. Sweden in 2005, it says, but it was actually, we had the tsunami, and the government moved the date back to December 17, so the hundreds of people who died in the tsunami would not be affected by the estate tax. And going on down, yes. So in these countries, there is no estate or inheritance tax. Luxembourg, Serbia, Slovenia, Australia, Austria, Canada, Norway, and so on. This is just, I won't get into this, but this is an American calculation of how much the GNP would grow, 0.8%, they said, if the estate tax was abolished. The thing with the US is that the exemption is very high. In Sweden, the exemption was very low, which my example with the summer house showed. It were just a few $1,000s. Here, this shows that Obama has done something for the rich people in America, increasing the level here. It was no estate tax, it was repealed in 2010, and then it's been moved up to, so you only pay it over $5 million. And that means that per year now in America, you have about 3,000 estates that actually pay the estate tax. They differ between the estate taxes paid by the estate and the inheritance tax by the people who get the money or the wealth. So, but a lot of thousands and others in America plan for the estate, of course, and keep a lot of lawyers busy. Okay, in other countries it's also quite high, like France is $105,000, Germany about $400,000, and so on. So that's a little bit about the inheritance tax, and I will move on to the next topic, tax planning and inheritance tax. And first let me say that tax planning is not only legitimate, but a necessity and the duty of the financial management of a company. It is simply their job to minimize these costs as other costs are reviewed and minimized. I've been an internal controller myself in one of the companies that I worked with. This leads to a number of decisions where you have to use judgment, examine the rules, and in total have a consensus within the company management as to how you want the company run. To me, now I'm getting into some personal comment, but to me it's astonishing that internationally, from one part of an international company to another, very high interest rates have been used and have been allowed to be used. We are here talking maybe even 13% interest rate on a Swedish company here who's quite profitable, going to a finance company in Luxembourg, for instance. And these sort of transactions are often not even necessary. But it's been used a lot and is still being used. It's been criticized a lot too. Then we have the issue, which is not quite as obvious, of internal pricing, which is an even more difficult and complex issue. So a question of internal royalties, of products being sold across the borders, and so on. And in this area, this is a very large gray area which is not being discussed very much. But here also, of course, you can minimize your taxes. This leads to the taxation authorities to try to harmonize taxes more and more to avoid these kinds of tax plannings, especially across Europe. And in general, the attitude of society is positive towards business and entrepreneurship these days. It was different in the 70s and part of the 80s, when the growth of the public sector was thought to be the secure and good future for all. And now we see the results of that. Lately, the tax havens in general, and Panama in particular, have been making the news. There are probably many legitimate reasons to use a tax haven for some companies, but in the future these will be more scrutinized both by tax inspectors and media. Internet and search engines have changed the media landscape and created transparency where there used to be secrecy. This also this is also important, of course, how politicians use our tax money, and tax interest groups playing an active role in many countries to expose corruption, which is One aspect we worked a lot with, in the international taxpayers movement that we don't need. This is an American page. The Open the Books group in America is one of my favorite groups. They are trying to get every public expense there is in America, state, federal, state, and local, on a database, so that everybody can search it and expose how their local or national politicians are actually using the money. And they do a fantastic job. They sometimes are being followed and not, let's say, not much appreciated by some politicians. Now, let's have a quick look at the Panama Papers. They say it's an enormous journalistic achievement. I'm not sure it is a journalistic achievement, but it's certainly a big hacker achievement and a really big job to create this database. 140 politicians, more than 50 countries, and so on. And it's extremely easy to search. I mean, the database is super fast. I just did a search on Churchill. Okay, bang, there you have. It just comes up, all the connections. I did a search on Barnevik just for fun. There came up two hits. I also tried a few of our politicians, got nothing, fortunately. And what you get then, the next step, you click on one of those things, and you get here the name of the shareholder, Wealth of Africa Company Limited, and his home address in London. Whether this is good journalism or not, I don't know. But anyway, this is how this works, and sometimes you get big spider-like networks coming out of this. So it's very easy for journalists to use this. And here is a list of the 10 banks that have created most of these companies. Now, the next question to me is then, what will the media do with all this access of information? And it's not only this, it's other databases as well. And a few years ago, I was at a debate at the Swedish journalist club, Publicistklubben. And a Finnish journalist was on the panel that talked about the role of journalism and how it was developing. And she was very envious of how the Swedish journalists were able to drive causes in the news and in the papers. And whereas in Finland they were very restricted to more reporting facts and have a neutral standpoint in a more objective way. And with the wealth of easy information, declining resources for journalists, and at the same rate that the number of bloggers are increasing quickly, and what you read on internet might be actually determined by some kind of algorithm in the back that Google has, which pushes certain kind of stuff to you that you seem to be interested in. You wonder about the state of information and the future of journalism. And then bringing this back to the tax harmonization and tax evasion, it is natural that tax authorities within the EU, for instance, are trying to harmonize taxes. This might actually be contrary to the interest of the taxpayers. And one of the causes we are pushing in the international taxpayers movement is tax competition, which I think has led to lowering taxes and good circumstances for businesses in many countries. Tax evasion, I think, will decline because of increased transparency, like we've seen. Companies and persons will likely in the future think twice before making arrangements through Panama or other tax havens. If, as a bonus, some of the estimated 500 billion from the narcotics trade going into the banking system, especially maybe in New York, in various ways, if this can be traced and stopped, it will be good for humanity, it seems. There will in the future be more transparency, both on how taxes are collected and used or misused in the future, and also how companies are setting up their business. This is something we should welcome and hope that the media also will use prudence in how this information is used. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Staffan. Now I'd like to welcome our commentators to the floor. We have three commentators on this panel. We have Richard Zundrich. He speaks English like an American, and I cannot, it's difficult. Richard Zuntrich, I don't know how to pronounce it. Anyway, Richard has a doctorate in law, but works as a financial advisor. He's also a long-standing board member of the Austrian Economic Center and the Hayek Institute. After Staffan, we will listen to Anders Ydstedt, who is a serial entrepreneur. I didn't check that with you, but I know you call yourself that sometimes. Not least in Scantex Strategy Advisors. He's also the chairman of Svensk Tidskrift, a weekend journal of politics, economics, and culture, founded in 1911. That is, as I mentioned earlier, a co-organizer of this event. And Anders is also a tax expert. And last but not least, we have Nick Hubble, who writes the Free Market Roadshow newsletter, used to work for Money Week in the UK. And can I say in public what your next job is? He's going to be a trapeze artist somewhere in Asia.
Yeah, Singapore.
Singapore, yeah. I think that's an interesting career. Anyway, all three of you, please come up on stage, and we'll start with, as I said, with Richard. Yeah, please give me an applause.
I think I'm going to start this like an AA meeting. My name is Richard Zuntrich, and in all likelihood, I am a crook. As most of you in the audience are very likely crooks. The reason I'm very likely a crook is I worked for a very long time in banking, doing some of these wonderful things mentioned in the introduction. Optimizing taxes for individuals and companies. Now, I was and still am of the opinion that everything we did at the time was perfectly legal. The reason it was perfectly legal and just took, a little bit of thinking and a little bit of planning was that taxes are, both taxes and public policy and other things in most countries, are extremely different. The way countries are run, their tax systems, their social security systems are different, and I think rightfully so. However, countries have a tendency never to repeal laws, on the one hand. So you have tax law upon tax law upon tax law. Then you have countries doing treaties with each other who want to do trade, and they're called double taxation agreements, the idea being that you pay tax either in one country or in another country, but if you're good at this stuff, you can end up paying tax in neither country perfectly legally, which is what we did. And I am very proud of the fact that, the German taxpayer, did not get 5 billion in taxes from various high-level companies, thanks for a very clever scheme I thought up. Things are treated differently. Things can be capital in one country, can be loans in other countries, can be beneficial. I think also here in Sweden you benefited from Argentinian papers which were tax-free. You bought it at deep discounts, you were getting 30% interest rate tax-free. This is all the stuff we did in the day and is still going on, and I remember a memorable cocktail party between the highest Austrian tax official and one of our tax lawyers that we used, and he went over to our tax lawyer and he said, we know what you're doing, we're going to pass a law, and this route you're using to save taxes is not going to work anymore. And our professor, doctor, we're very proud of titles in Austria. Looked the guy in the eye and said, well, then we'll just think of something new. And this is the way the world works. And in Austria, at least, it says in the tax code, the taxpayer has the right to use legally any means possible to reduce his tax burden. It's legally allowed. Now, we were speaking of the death tax and the wealth tax, and we said, abolished in Austria in 2008. And this is just one of the examples of how these things work very strangely. In Austria, we have land, and we have a very powerful constituency of the Conservative Party, which is the landowners and the farmers. So land is taxed at a very low rate, also when it's passed on and on an ongoing basis. And then we did have an inheritance and a wealth tax in Austria. And if you inherited a house for 1 million krona, you would pay 6% taxes. And if you inherited 1 million krona cash, you would pay, depending on your situation, up to 50% taxes. Now, at some point in time, somebody figured this out, went to the Austrian Constitutional Court and said, that's not fair. My sister got the house, I got the cash, she's still got the house, half of my cash is gone. Therefore, this was declared unconstitutional. And therefore, Austria no longer has a wealth tax at the moment, replaced by a very weird capital gains tax, which now people are doing all kinds of things like mentioned with the debit notes, and, the value of the house is reduced by the right of my mother to live until 125 in that building, and all of these people can get very, very creative when they're trying to avoid taxes. Now, on the one hand, due to the differences in the tax codes and the cultural differences between countries, I believe there are and always should be differences in that. I don't believe that these things can be harmonized without, having a global centralized, or either a global or a EU centralized government telling us to do everything, which you may have gathered I'm not really in favor of. The second thing, it is detrimental mainly to middle-income people and mid-sized companies. Big international companies can hire people like me and Rothschild and HSBC and whatever, and you can come up with all kinds of things to make it work. That is very expensive, so I would say if you want to really avoid tax, you've got to have a certain amount of money, otherwise it's just not worth it. On the other hand, if you lower taxes in a country to a certain degree and you attract people to your country and companies to your country with lower tax rates, at a certain point it doesn't become worth it anymore to avoid taxes, and that's why you always see that tax income goes up when you lower taxes to a certain rate. And I guess I'll stop here before I'm hogging the floor.
Thank you. Thanks for those words. Anders, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks for introduction, Staffan. You said that the Swedish death tax was abolished right out of the blue in 2004, and I must perhaps tell you a little bit more about that, because at that time I was the campaign manager for the campaign against the death tax in Sweden, and it was a little bit like it was quite a big campaign, and it was a little bit like you described in Austria. In Sweden we have different taxes on if an individual person, or it was the discussion how to save small family business, how to make the transfer between generations. And then they had the discussion, should we have capital, working capital, they were talking about active capital in small companies, should that be free from the inheritance tax or not? And they have a big state committee working for 2-3 years about that. Should we exempt family business from the inheritance tax? And eventually this group didn't really find any solution, and then the politicians found the solutions. It's more fair if everyone pays the same level. zero, then we exempt some groups. And we have exactly the same discussion now in Germany. They have the Constitution Court in Karlsruhe has found that the exemption for family business in Germany is unconstitutional. And I hope they will have find the same solution as in Sweden. We have a zero level. Our editor-in-chief in Svensk Tidskrift, Amanda Wollsten, and I wrote a book last year about the history of how the Swedish death tax got away in 2004. You can find that on bookstores. I will start perhaps to have a discussion with you. I thought we should have the same opinion, but actually I don't have at all. I think you're wrong about how big multinational corporation works, because I think, first of all, the whole discussion when you talk about multinational corporation and not paying their fair share and so, it's corporate taxes. How big is corporate taxes in the total? You think it's like in the industrial world, it's like 5% of the total tax revenues. It's 5%. The rest is consumption taxes and income taxes. We have a big debate, the G20 meetings, G8, demo tax protesters, tax campaigners and so on are protesting. It's about 5% of the taxes. Corporate income tax is a more important revenue in developing world, and then that's a special problem that should we work about how to tax oil production and so on, and perhaps countries in Africa should develop their tax services and so. But that has nothing to do with Google or Amazon or Facebook or H&M paying their taxes. In Sweden, they try to hang out the H&M stores because their business in Bangladesh doesn't pay any corporate income tax in Bangladesh. But they have no business in Bangladesh. They have procurement. They buy their clothes. They create a lot of values, a lot of jobs. A lot of people works for industry that produce clothes for H&M, and they pay taxes. But why should H&M pay corporate income tax only for procurement? And the same, I think, about Google making business in UK. They have sales force selling services, but they're not producing the service in UK. It's a sales force. And if you try to shift the whole tax landscape, that's what's making now this base erosion, profit shifting, the EU project, ATA, anti-tax avoidance package, and UN is working with. If you shift the whole landscape only for 5% of the total tax revenue, everything else will also change. Because businesses have to if you have to follow this system, then you have to move your headquarters, you have to move your research, you have to move your IP portfolio and so on. And the only winners in this discussion will probably be the the politicians in bigger countries with more people, and they will move everything. And that could in short term perhaps be a good idea for France or UK and so on, because small countries like Sweden will be a loser because we have to move our export industry to France and so on to make deductions also in France. But I think the big loser, that's the free market, because you should have the specialization and trade and so on. If you can't do cross-border business, then and I think all those projects like BEPS and ATA and so on, they will put an obstacle on free trade. And of course, there will always people who do this treaty business and using and so on. You have to work on those kind of treaties. But if you shift the whole landscape, that's the business today. They say the fair share is that corporations should pay taxes where the sales are. Then you have to also move the whole corporations to where the sales are. And then you can forget about what Adam Smith told us and Ricard and so on, everything about specialization. I think all those politicians who read Bastiat, because they see only this 5%, the tax avoidance that the UN calculated, big corporation tax avoidance could be like maximum 14% globally and then it's 14% of 5%. So this whole discussion about this, of course, it's a lot of debate and protesters and so on. But if you shift the whole tax lanes because of that.
We're talking about two different things
Yeah.
here that I referred to, and it was the tax haven discussion. Of
Yeah.
course, we agree that I say, corporations, I am a firm believer that everything should, if possible, only be taxed once at a certain level. And I mean, ideally, you would have, no corporate tax, and you would tax it someplace, and it's a big discussion where and when that should be taxed, be it on the labor or on the consumption tax or land taxes or whatever. I'm not going to get into that, but it should only be taxed once. The second thing, and this is important, and it was touched upon in the key speech, the so-called tax havens are not only havens for tax purposes, they've only been called for that. There are perfectly legitimate reasons to keep your money someplace else than the country you live. I'm thinking of the poor Russians and Venezuelans and all kind of other countries in the world whose currencies have just massively devalued, and they've lost money. They like to keep a certain amount in dollars or Swiss francs or krona or whatever outside of the country. That is one reason. Another reason is, totalitarian governments that come after your money, and you want to be safe. I mean, for years and years and years after World War II, Austrians kept their money in Switzerland, not because they wanted to save taxes on their money in Switzerland, but the Russians were on the border and could walk in any minute. So, you always had a little bit. And then, finally, somebody came after the money in Switzerland. So that's the general thing. I mean, they're going after poor Emma Watson. You know Emma Watson? Harry Potter, she does spells and so on. She's in the Panama Papers. Being in the Panama Papers does not per se mean you have done anything illegal. She happens to be a famous actress who doesn't necessarily want everybody to know what she's doing. Leave her alone. Okay, so, but to get to this point, what tax havens and these jurisdictions do is facilitate the transfer of capital worldwide from one place to another when it is not possible directly. And these are pools of money there that can be used and are very beneficial. And if we dry them up, we will really hurt world trade. So just that was
And
my
going back to
interjection.
Bastiat, what you see
Yeah.
and what you don't see,
Yeah.
I think also we all benefit from the institutional the competition between different jurisdictions and different tax levels and so on. So probably the taxes would be much higher if there weren't any tax havens. So
Yeah.
definitely. So I will give my own example from one of our business, what will happen now in the European Union. We have an internet sales company where we have a robot that sell used internet domains. We're actually the biggest in the world selling used Swedish domains names. And we sell them all over the world globally. And we have to pay VAT on that sales. And then the politicians in Brussels thought out that they should make this simpler, so they introduced the mini one-stop shop, they call it. That's the European online sales systems. And it's so complicated, so we actually put up a robot to stop customers from Europe. So we say, if private customers coming to our business, we say, unfortunately, since 2 years, we have this simplified VAT system for European companies. Unfortunately, we can't sell to you. You can move to Norway, or you can move to South Africa or something like that. So we sell domain names to all over the world, and the private persons in all over the world and Sweden, but not in European Union. And that's the new European system. And I think now I read yesterday that we'll introduce this system not only to online sales, but also to web sales on small products and so on also. So, and they try to you have in the US, they have this extraterritorial tax system where you have to pay tax in the US everywhere in the world. And the European politicians now want to introduce the same thing in Europe. So you have to pay VAT. As a Swede, you have to pay Swedish VAT if you go to Germany and so on. And you probably have to keep your passport with you and so on. And so on the one side, you have politicians talking about free trade and how we should open up markets. On the other side, you have the tax people stopping the same, blocking and putting up more obstacles to free trade. And I think that's the other side of this discussion about the tax landscape.
You're done?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Sorry. I'm with it hurts my business.
Yeah. No, okay, I just wanted to make sure that you're finished. Thank you so much for that. Now I'm going to give the floor to Nick, who's going to give his comments.
Sounds good. 10 minutes still?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so thanks for having me. Thanks for learning English, everyone. This would be a disaster if you didn't speak English. A very long conference for both of us. My accent is Australian, but I grew up in Germany, England, Ireland, Scotland, Austria, and Australia. So I'm practically European for you. Most of the reason for the moving around was tax competition, funnily enough. We moved around for my dad's job, and that company moved around for tax competition, and since then for tax competition itself for both of my parents, who decided to live on opposite sides of the world to avoid each other. And actually, I grew up playing bandy as a kid with my neighbour, so I'm practically Swedish as well for you. So our topic is taxes and death, or death and taxes, and I've got a really big problem with that topic, because taxes are the symptom. Taxes are what you get after government spending. If you try and solve taxes by itself, you're just going to be left with inflation or debt, which is effectively just a tax as well. So if you want to have lower taxes, you have to go for spending, government spending first. Australia, where I lived for the last 13 years, is a good example of that. In the 90s, they cut spending first and then taxes followed. So what I would like to do is avoid the topic a little bit, or address it indirectly, and talk about the justification for government spending. A lot of people, I'm guessing people at this institute, have published things like wasteful government spending, publications showing how ridiculous the EU or the Swedish government can be and what it spends. And that's the type of thing that I like to hear about. But for the last few years, I've actually slowly gotten more and more extreme about this. Just what should the government be spending money on? That's one of the big questions that comes up. And I like to think of myself now as a consistent libertarian, which means I apply the same ideas to everything. And the result of that is that I'm pretty much an anarchist. I think the government should do absolutely nothing, and that would solve the problem of taxes itself too. Now, that sounds outrageous, and I'm not coming at it from an ideological angle. So what I'm going to try and do for you is start you off on the journey to being a consistent libertarian, to becoming an anarchist. So what's the justification for government spending? What is it that they need to provide us with? What's the economic term for it? Come on, you must know. Public goods, right? The government has to provide public goods. Justice is one example of them. What are some other public goods that only the government can provide for us? National defense, what else? What are things that only the government will do? Agricultural subsidies. Protection of private... Yeah. So the typical examples... actually, we should start with the first example of a public good. If you read Adam Smith, he uses lighthouses as his example of something that only the government can provide. Because how does a lighthouse make money? Who would build a lighthouse? Who would pay for that? How would a lighthouse charge its clients? If one of the clients decided not to pay the lighthouse fee, the lighthouse can't just turn the light off because all the other ships are stuffed, right? So the lighthouse is a perfect example of all the problems that the government can fix. Now, in the 20s, a guy called Ronald Coase, who went on to win the Nobel Prize, decided to research the history of lighthouses. And he found they were privately run, privately built, quite profitable, and the government took them over because they were making money off the public safety. So, hundreds of years, we read about lighthouses being the public good that all economists used as their example, and they got it wrong. So lighthouses, the private sector can do it pretty well, it turns out, especially these days. Next example, schools. So especially primary schools, right? The poor can't afford private schooling. There's no way that poor people can pay for these beautiful private schools that some of us were lucky enough to go to. Well, this guy called James Tooley, he was an expert on building schools in developing countries. And one day he left this brand new school that the United Nations or the EU had paid for in India, and he decided to go for a walk into a slum. And he came across a private school in a tin shed with a sewage canal running down the middle of it. And the teacher was just a mother of one of the children. And he said, "What are you doing? We've got a free school with, famous school teachers just up the road. It's free, it's a beautiful building, they have beautiful new toilets, it's safe, they get all these wonderful benefits." And the mum said, "But they don't learn there. The teachers hate us, they don't respect us. The results are terrible, they come home, we speak better English than they do." So I decided to teach my child myself. And then my neighbor said, "Well, your child is learning English better than my child at the school, so would you mind teaching my child?" And she says, "Yes, but for a fee." And it snowballed from there, and all of a sudden you had a big for-profit private school in a slum in India. So this changed James Tooley's thinking, and he went out looking for similar schools all around the world, and he found hundreds of them. In fact, he now estimates between 80 and 60% of children in slums in some sub-Saharan Africa, in India, in China, it's especially high, are privately educated, usually in for-profit schools. And they almost always do better than the local government school on exam results, on the national exam results. So schools are out. Lighthouses, schools, private sector does better. Roads. Roads are my favorite example. So I went to a speech by a guy called Walter Block in Australia. I'm timing myself to make sure I don't go. I'm not texting my friends. He gave a speech about who would build the roads. Who would build the roads if the government didn't do it? And there was a guy sitting next to me, and he kept on shaking his head and scoffing, and he was really annoyed with this guy. And the speech is really good. You can watch it online for free at YouTube. Just Google who would build the roads. And so at the end of the speech, I introduced myself to Buddy, and Buddy builds roads for a living. I said, that's why you didn't like the speech, because you work for the government. And he said, no, I build roads. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, there's all these places in Australia where the government roads either won't be built or they're not sufficient for the use, for example, in the mines or the cattle trucks that are huge and heavy. So I build roads for these people, these private companies, and they have to be better than the government roads, or they have to be different to the government roads. And he explained to me how that system works. So it turns out that the speech was wrong by Walter Block. There's actually many different ways of doing it that Walter Block hasn't thought of. So the academic, again, got it wrong, at least when it comes to Australia, and my friend Buddy builds roads. So that's roads out. The legal system. The legal system's an excellent example, providing justice. Now, where does the British legal system come from? It comes from a private, non-government system that existed right around the Mediterranean and up to Britain. It's based on maritime law, maritime trade law. And it turns out that people didn't trust governments, and that's why they went to this private system. And it worked quite well, and then eventually the British government took it over, because governments like taking over things that work, right? So the justice system, at least what the British system is based on, was privately run, privately enforced. The other part of justice is, of course, police forces, the enforcement of this justice. I didn't know this, but apparently Georgia has recently privatized its police force because the government police force was too corrupt. So now private companies provide the law enforcement in Georgia. I don't know anything about that. I don't even know if it's true, to be honest, but Barbara Kolm, the president of the Austrian Economic Centre, was telling me about it. Apparently it's working quite well, but I haven't had time to research that. So maybe even police is also better provided by the private sector. Water, I learnt this on the roadshow. Tenerife has privatized water completely, because all they need to do is drill sideways into the mountain that they all live on, and water comes out the tunnel. The government's trying to take it over because it's working too well. Everybody has access to their own water, so the government can't control people and bill people, and it's a problem for the government that things are working too well. Money. Money is another good one. How many different note-issuing banks are there in the United Kingdom? How many different names of banks are on banknotes in the United Kingdom? It's close to 10, I think. There's four in Scotland. Royal Bank of Scotland, Clydesdale Bank, Bank of Scotland, and the Bank of England. There's one in Isle of Man, and there's one in Isle of Wight, and there's 3 in Northern Ireland. Why? Because money used to be provided by the private sector, not by the government. The government took it over because it worked too well. So, and there's lots of wonderful information about the free banking system, where banks could issue as much money as they wanted. They could create as much money as they wanted. And they were held accountable by things like bank runs. It worked very well, apparently. That's what the history says. It might still work today. I suppose Bitcoin might test us. So those are some of my examples. I could keep going for you, but it's sort of pointless. What I'm trying to do is get you thinking, get you on the journey to becoming a consistent libertarian. So my last question to you is, how many examples do you need before you start to realize that just because I can't tell you how the private sector would do something, that doesn't mean the private sector couldn't do it better. So for example, someone in North Korea might say, what do you mean no one organizes the supermarket? And that's silly to us, but to them, they can't imagine it. So if I was in North Korea and I couldn't explain to you how supermarkets work, would that mean that I'm wrong, that the private sector can do a better job than the government? No. There is something about the private sector that means it inherently does better on, I think, literally everything. What those things are, we can debate about all the time, but the examples I've just given you prove that at least on those examples, the private sector does do better. And they're the type of things that people say are public goods. So how many examples do you need before you start to see this principle? I've got another 15 seconds. One of the things you should focus on if you start to believe what I do is that you shouldn't be trying to change the government, you should be trying to create alternatives. You should be looking at things like Bitcoin. You should be looking at things like mediation instead of going to the court system, the privatized court system. There's lots of opportunities like that. Compete with the government, don't try and change it. Thank you.
Exit rather than voice.
Exit rather than...
Voice in the setup of how to change a dysfunctional organization. Yeah, yeah. Very interesting. Thank you very much. You made me think a lot. Does any of the speakers want to comment on any of the other speakers first? Yeah, Anders, go ahead.
I will give Nick one example of a privatized court in Sweden. If we have a conflict between a domain buyer, like we sell domain coca-cola.se, that's not a court issue. It's a privatized solution system we have here. Organized private, yeah, and it works really good. And all countries, we get a lot of lawyers from France and so on, and try to go to court here against us. And we just say it's a privatized solution system, works very well. Here is the web address. Good luck.
Is this on? Also with the police, the security companies are taking over more and more and fulfilling the police functions in all societies and in our society.
If you get one anarchist in a room, all the other ones pop out of nowhere. They know it's safe and you won't throw anything at us. So.
Yeah.
And one on roads, as you well know, as I think you know, but make sure everyone else does. It's incredibly easy now to sell the roads and privatize every single road. It's electronically trivial. And then you would pay your road bill monthly like you pay your gas bill. And there would be signs by the road raising the price when congestion is high, and we wouldn't have to build any more roads.
On roads,
Perfect.
I have a good friend from Guatemala. He told me the example how they're building a road that cost $10 million to build, and they're getting foreign support for it. And it was going through various stages, and by the time the Americans came to pay for it, it was $65 million. And the Americans were very happy. They spent $65 million on a good road in Guatemala, and everybody in between, down to the 10 million, were also very happy.
50% of the Swedish roads are private, but the problem with the government is they are not building only roads, they build those bridges to nowhere. And that's also a problem with government spending.
Yes.
I think we have a bad example in Sweden. I'm talking about foreign aid. And we have decided politically that we are going to spend 1% of our GNP every year in foreign aid, regardless of whether the aid is needed and how it's going to be used. And this has led to more and more what they call budget aid, which means we're shipping the money straight into the state budget in all these countries where they are used for anything, and in eventually maybe even for arms.
And Swiss bank accounts.
And maybe Swiss bank accounts, yes. We have in one of our members in Ghana, they are have an example. They have protested against something like $125 million came in to start jobs, and when the money came out for the projects at the other end, all the money was gone, so the money was sort of lost. And they've attacked this openly, and they're now being threatened in the street. People come up and tell to me, "I know where you live," and you know. Yeah, it's. Can be dangerous also to work for
I just have-
transparency.
I just have one thing to add to my speech, and something that is very dangerous currently, and that is when people do their planning and tax planning and so on for the future, they should be able to count on these things working and being legal according to the system. What has been happening in recent years is that governments have not only changed the laws when they didn't work something, they have begun to change all of these rules retroactively. And they have messed up international mergers by changing the rules. They have messed up. You have to, at least if you believe that there has to be a law, which some people don't, but you have to be able to plan ahead of time. It messes up the market totally if governments and coercive trans-government organizations end up changing the rules retroactively, and that is a terrible trend that we have to watch out for.
May I ask you, you made me think, Nick, of course, and I just want to, one part of free market is competition, and one consequence of competition is creative destruction. It can be dirty, chaotic. It's supposed to be dirty and chaotic, but that's for firms. But do we really want the justice system to be dirty and chaotic?
Yep, we do. Definitely. So, I mean, it wasn't, first of all, historically. It wasn't dirty and chaotic when it was fully privatised legal system around the Mediterranean up to the UK, because the governments weren't involved. In fact, the only dirty part of it was when the governments tried to get involved, because they wanted a monopoly to be able to control the trade and the maritime issues. But, I mean, I think it would be surprising if the private sector justice system was worse than the government provided one. And also, the incentive is to provide what the consumer of the justice system wants. Right? So if we agree and we're clear between each other, then there's no reason to be dirty justice and competitive. But if we agree on something, we have a contract and there's a judge, and the judge does something dirty and dishonest, then we just go to someone else for the next one. So what's the incentive? It's to not be dirty and unjust. So all the incentives, I mean, you can accuse, well, put it this way, are supermarkets dirty? No. Privatised roads dirty? They tend to be significantly less dirty than the government-provided ones. So, you know, the anarchist system is never perfect. It's only ever better. And it's almost always better.
Thank you very much. Now it's time for questions from the audience. You guys are going to be joining us. So there's a guy running around with the mic. Please state your name and any affiliation, if relevant.
Paula Röttorp. And since I'm a lawyer, of course, I'll ask about private courts. De facto, all big commercial transactions in Sweden is handled through arbitration and not court, because we don't trust the courts.
How's the arbitrator selected?
By the parties. Normally, they choose one party each, and then they choose the arbitrator.
I'm running out of room for my examples.
But there are, and the advantages of this is that it's quicker. It's slightly more expensive normally, but not necessarily. And of course, it is what the parties want it to be, i.e. confidential. On the other hand, it means that the rest of us do not have access to the cases. So we don't know what the case law actually says. So the advantage of a court and the advantage of a uniform legal system is, of course, the ability for everyone to actually read and get the information. When it's only arbitrators, of course, they have, many of them serve in many arbitrational tribunals, but you still have a lack of certainty due to confidentiality. And of course, the parties will always choose confidentiality. No one wants to have the dirt out in the open.
That's not necessarily true. If their customers value transparency in contracts, for example, if it was a lawyer, for example, you would only go to a lawyer who is transparent in all of their dealings, right? And they would only be contracted to an arbitrator who enforces that transparency. Because that's why anyone does anything in a free market, is to satisfy their customers. They're serving their customers. And if part of serving your customer is transparency in your agreements, then an arbitrator could provide that in a free market system. I don't know how the Swedish system
In
is
theory,
working.
they could, but why would they?
Because
no
they're
one wants
serving their customers by doing so. So, for example, I would
theory.
not have your legal services provided to me without me knowing every part of your dealings with your arbitrator.
Yeah, but you don't want everyone else to know it.
No, but I as the customer of your legal service, or say you're a supermarket, I as a customer of your supermarket services, grocery store services, could only decide to only go to your shop if you were committed to someone who enforces transparency. So
Yes.
all these...
But typically it's against your interest, because you don't want to have your own case published.
But the customer wants to have... I'm a customer of a...
I think you're missing each other here.
Yeah. So I confused you because you're a lawyer. So
Well, I think we're all
Yes,
confused by the confusion, and let's see if there's any other questions. Yes. Please state your name. and-
Nilani Jungrande Silva. I'm from Stockholm University and I'm a researcher. This question is to you. And you were talking about you're talking about privatization, and you were talking about privatization is better than the government, and then why? And then it's quite like neoliberal view, and. So how do you explain that 2008 when we had this problem because the government
Yep.
was kept aside, and how do you explain that?
So how do you describe what happened in 2008? What went wrong? How would you describe it? Where did things go wrong? They went wrong in the housing market?
They went wrong everywhere. It affected maybe not so much in Sweden, but
Yep.
the rest of the world.
So but what would the principal places that things were wrong went housing and banking?
Banking,
So
yeah.
they're
Please,
the two-
please let him answer so we can.
They're the two areas, right? So the price of housing and banking is heavily influenced by the interest rate, which is controlled by the central bank, which is effectively a government institution. So again, you've just got government. If the government manipulates the price of oranges, you'd expect a shortage or a surplus in the orange market. The government controlled the price of debt. We got a surplus of debt and a shortage of housing, and the whole thing went out of whack. It's exactly what you would expect from any government intervention.
Sorry. My name is Per Bretham. I'm a commercial lawyer and IP lawyer. Not an economist, though, so I might be a bit off here. You said about the tax harmonization. I agree with you on that. But the same rationale, does that go for, say, what is things that are not taxes, but like customs and tariffs and other things, or is harmonization also a bad thing there, or a good thing? I mean, trying to lower tariffs and customs.
Well, on trade and customs, we of course are for the idea that there is as much of that as possible. So I would harmonize them at zero, if possible. Usually there's a difference because a tax is something that you levy in your own country, whereas you also levy, of course, your tariffs on the way in, but that changes your price of goods. So usually countries will deal directly with each other, either two countries doing a trade agreement, a EU-wide trade agreement to allow free trade in Europe, or now the huge discussion that we're having between, trade agreement between the EU and the US, or the US and Asia. Different things, in my opinion. And if you're talking about a certain American presidential candidate advocating the higher tariff system to save jobs or keep them in the country, it very simply results in higher prices of those goods that the tariff is run on, because you can do that and have your iPhone made in China, and Mr. Trump I'm not wearing it today. I have a Trump signature shirt by the guy. It says "Made in China."
Okay, if there are no other questions, I think we should thank this panel with a round of applause. And now it's time
Thank
for a
you.
coffee break, and we'll be back here in 20 minutes for the second panel.
Sure, make it short, make it short.
You can sit down for Deirdre's speech, and then we'll ask if you to come up afterwards. Should we get seated, please? I hope you enjoyed the coffee and the sweets. I forgot to tell you afterwards, there's going to be a short mingle afterwards as well, and some wine and so on for those of you who want to stay. Anyway, welcome back. Now we have the second panel, and it's about jobs and entrepreneurship in Europe of change. Europe lacks jobs, and jobs are created by entrepreneurs. Those are two simple facts that cannot be ignored. But in the discussion about the European economy, in post-crisis recovery and so on, there's not enough talk about the role of the entrepreneur. But one person who speaks and has thought and written a lot about entrepreneurs is Deirdre McCloskey, the main speaker of the second panel. Deirdre is Distinguished Professor of Economics, History, English, and Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She has written 16 books and around 400 scholarly pieces. Her latest book, number 3 in a trilogy on the bourgeois era, is called Bourgeois Equality: How Ideas, Not Capital or Institutions, Enriched the World. We're very proud to have this international intellectual and academic star here at Timbro today. The floor is yours. Please give her an applause.
Thank you. I'm somewhat familiar with Scandinavia, so I know the law of Janta. And I know that kind of introduction is only embarrassing. Thank you very much. We are going to talk about entrepreneurship. John Chisholm, my colleague, is an entrepreneur. I'm not. I'm just a teacher and a scholar. And in fact, early in my career as a tough little Chicago economist, quantitative mathematical type from I was very hostile to the idea of entrepreneurship as important. And that's just because I didn't understand it correctly. I'm not so sure that other people at the time understood it correctly either. My friend, friendly enemy, David Landis, a great economic historian, would always emphasize entrepreneurship, but what he meant was an internal psychological state. This is in accord with Max Weber's great book, 1905, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, where the idea is that a psychological change, in that case caused by becoming a Calvinist, made people work harder, made them more attentive to the world, and made for economic growth. And I've finally come around to thinking that entrepreneurship is the key to how economies work. I've become more and more of an Austrian economist as I've gotten older. Of course, I've been everything. My first formation was as an anarchist. But not the kind that my colleague was talking about. Not that kind of anarchist, not a free market anarchist, but a socialist anarchist. Prince Kropotkin was my hero, my first hero. And then Marx, and then Keynes, and then, I've been everything. I've been an atheist. Now I'm an Anglican, if you think that's an improvement. And I was a man, and now I'm a woman, and that definitely is an improvement. So I've been everything. So I can understand our friends on the left, not so much our friends on the right, but our friends on the left, when they feel hostile and worried by markets and entrepreneurship. But I don't think that the change that made the modern world entrepreneurially was a psychological change. I think there are probably in this population, say, 10% of us, maybe 15%, who want to innovate radically, whether in business terms or intellectual terms. I don't mean that the others are useless dolts. I don't mean that. They have honorable roles in the society. But the true entrepreneurs are rare. And as I think all our speakers will emphasize, they too often make mistakes. Surely the government does, but as a famous coach in the United States said, Yogi Berra, he said it's hard to predict, especially about the future. And it surely is. So entrepreneurship is not mechanical, but so far as psychological readiness for it, I think perhaps 10 or 15%. But in different times and in different countries, there have been radically different attitudes towards entrepreneurship. For example, India. A student of mine named Adya did a very interesting PhD dissertation looking at attitudes towards the economy shown in movies in India, Bollywood movies. And he watched lots of these movies, which sounds like a nice way to do a PhD in economics. And he found that in the 50s and the 60s, in the first mad enthusiasm for socialism in India, the heroes of the Bollywood movies were all government employees, policemen, government planners, government agricultural extension workers. They were the good guys. And the bad guys, as they are in Swedish crime fiction, were all entrepreneurs. We're all business people. And this, after 20 years of the licensurage, where to move a machine in your own factory, you had to get planning permission from the government, and the man from the government, surprise, surprise, had his hand out for a bribe. I saw such a bribe being paid in India just last year. So even so, it hasn't changed completely. The Bollywood plots shifted, and they turned completely around. And in the 70s and 80s, before acknowledgement of the entrepreneur and the liberal idea, as Nick was saying earlier, that the private sector might be able to do it even better maybe than the government, this ideological change had taken place. Now my theme in this series is that. These are marvelous books which you may buy on Amazon. This is the Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. And it's a virtue ethical approach for those of you interested in this sort of thing. Not utilitarian, not Kantian, but Aristotelian, so to speak, arguing that a life in business is not ipso facto corrupting. Now, since most intellectuals believe it is, especially those who aren't in business, this is a somewhat heavy load of persuasion I have, which means it's a very thick book, 500 pages on this matter, showing that you can be a virtuous person. You can have courage and justice and love temperance, prudence, of course, hope and faith, and yet still be a private supplier of private goods. I then turned to the outstanding question in economics, having made an apology in the Greek sense, a defense of the entrepreneur in this book. I then asked, well, are the other explanations, the non-entrepreneurial explanations that I had sponsored for the first half of my career, that I against entrepreneurship? No, it's capital formation, you dope. Don't you understand? Aren't you an economist? It's trade. I went through all these explanations and found that I was wrong when I was young to reject human creativity as the cause, the economic cause of the modern world. And in this book, I go through all of them, at least as many as I can. I mean, every economic historian makes a reputation by proposing still another explanation for how we got so rich. And many of the economists, Acemoglu and so forth, have their own explanations, and I go through all of them. Doug North, my old friend who died last year, he has an explanation having to do with institutions and coal. Everyone loves coal. Non-economists especially like coal as the explanation. The British sit on a mountain of coal, therefore they industrialized. They don't explain why the Dutch, who didn't have any coal, but could import it across the North Sea, why they didn't have an industrial revolution until very late, yet they were the first commercial country in Northern Europe, the first bourgeois society in Northern Europe. The beginning of the modern world happened in Amsterdam. And it doesn't explain why the Chinese, who have been exploiting coal on a somewhat massive scale for 3 millennia, didn't have an industrial revolution. So I concluded, as you see from the title, Bourgeois Dignity, why economics can't explain the world, can explain the modern world, that the elevation of the bourgeoisie to social dignity is crucial for the modern world, for enrichment. It's not this internal psychology that Max Weber talked about, or that David Landis talked about. It's the attitude of the surrounding society that matters. Are they dignified? In India in the 1950s, they weren't. In India in the 1980s, they were. And this made all the difference. Then in the third volume, the concluding volume of this trilogy, I was going to make it 6 volumes at one point. And in a vulgar combination of Latin and Greek, I was going to call it a sexology and sell many, many more copies, alas, than I'm going to sell, unless you help me out here. But I had decided that although a trilogy might be considered somewhat self-indulgent, a tetralogy is an abomination, and a sexology doesn't meet the minimum standards of bourgeois virtue, because it's fraud, and we free market people are against fraud and violence. So anyway, this is an attempt at explaining why the bourgeoisie became dignified. And the answer, I think, well, let's first understand the magnitude of the phenomenon that we're trying to explain. If you don't understand anything about economic history in the last 2 centuries, understand this. That the factor of increase that we're talking about for, say, Sweden, which in 1800 has been called the impoverished sophisticate. My old teacher of mine, Lars Sandberg, wrote a famous essay about this a long time ago. Sweden in 1800 was the poorest country in Europe per capita. The only exception was Russia, which was poorer. And yet, look around you now, or look at Sweden in 1950. Sweden is now one of the richest countries in the world. And the factor of increase is about 30. Income per head in Sweden in 1800 was perhaps, in modern terms, in terms that you can understand as you walk out the door and attempt to live on it, was $3 a day per person. $3 a day. You sound, my God, $3 a day? How could anyone live on $3 a day? Well, a substantial percentage of the world's population still does. Now that percentage has been falling like a stone in the last 40 years, especially in the last 15 years. But still, there are people who live on $3 a day in Chad and Bangladesh, parts of it, and so forth. All right, and now in Sweden it's about $100 a day, or up to the 120. Most irritatingly, the land of my ancestors, or some of my ancestors, Norway, is richer now. I know this is irritating to Swedish people, but it's true. And it's oil. I accept that, but still, it's great. It's very pleasing to the ghost of my grandfather. He used to say, and this was an American, a Norwegian American who made up this rhyme. He used to say, 10,000 Swedes went through the weeds one day at Copenhagen. 10,000 Swedes went through the weeds, all chased by one Norwegian. But okay. So that's the transformation. Norway was also unspeakably poor in 1800. Yet, everyone could read, as for the most part it was true in Sweden too. So they were ready when in the middle of the 19th century, liberalism came. Free trade, ending of great restrictions on movement and occupation, licensure and banking and so forth. There was this explosion. So that's the magnitude we have to explain. And that's why I say in this middle book, why economics can't explain the modern world. Because supply and demand economics, which I teach and I love and is just wonderful, can't explain this. What we call in the trade Harburger triangles can't explain a factor of 30. That's 3,000% approximately. In fact, there's a case to be made that it's much higher because the quality of goods has enormously improved and continues to. I think it's actually accelerated in improvement. When I was young, we changed tires very frequently, not because they wore out, although they did, but because they blew out. And I'm very good at changing tires. And now tires have improved to the point where you don't change tires very often. And they last for 40,000 miles instead of 4,000. Automobiles themselves last much longer. So there's been and economics is better than it was, although it's been receding in the hands of Paul Krugman, but still. So in this final book, which is thick because I'm cramming all the volumes 3, 4, 5, 6 into one volume, I'm trying to explain why entrepreneurship became important. And that is, why it did, how it did, not why in the sense of the final cause, as Aristotle would say, but the efficient cause, that is, why did it happen? The answer, I think, is the coming of liberal ideas. And I mean this, you'll notice that the title is Bourgeois Equality. This is sort of a finger in the eye of Thomas Piketty, who I'm not contemptuous of. I wrote a long review, which you can find online, but of his book. But I, it's a serious book, wrong but serious. And that's what liberalism is. Adam Smith, the blessed Adam Smith, was above all an egalitarian. Now, we're not accustomed, if you haven't actually read Adam Smith and haven't read both of his books, he only wrote 2 books, he wouldn't be a distinguished professor in the modern world. 2 books, come on, that's not 2. But in his 2 books, his theme is that ordinary people are creative. Ordinary people should be left to do, to laissez-faire, the famous answer of the manufacturers in Paris. Laissez-faire is an assumption that ordinary people, as adults, as free adults, will and can take care of themselves. Now, I'm a Christian libertarian. I'm an Anglican, if you call that a Christian. And I believe that I have an obligation to help the poor. But my theme is that the best way to help the poor is to allow the economy to grow. And you allow the economy to grow by giving scope to entrepreneurs. And if you don't give scope, then all you can do to help the poor is to take from some people like me and give it to them. But that doesn't give you a factor of 30, even for the poor. It might increase the income of the very poor 50% or 100%, not 3,000%. It's modern economic growth that we need for the poor of the world, and have been getting to an extraordinary degree, especially in the last 15 years, despite the Great Recession. This is the time, I'm a historian, so I think in somewhat longer times than most people, but this is the time of the fastest economic growth in world history. Now. It's happening in China and India. In a couple of generations, India will have, if it continues on its present path of well over 5% per capita growth per year, in a couple of generations, maybe 2.5, it'll have an income equal to that of the United States now, per capita income. All right, so that's what we need to explain, and I say it's ideas, not investment. Investment is necessary. Piling brick on brick is necessary. Piling BAs on BAs to think of human capital is a good thing. But it's not initiating. It's ideas, entrepreneurial ideas. Buy low, sell high. Seeing $100 bills, as we said in the Chicago school, lying on the floor and picking them up. That's what initiates the investment. The investment is there. In the old days, we used to think that investment or capital was the constraint. I don't think so. Someone mentioned Ghana. We poured foreign aid into Ghana. Ghana, if what Bill Easterly calls capital fundamentalism were correct, that you could just push dams on Ghana and it would be better off, or build roads and be better off. If that worked, Ghana would be rich now. And what we used to call Red China, which didn't get a cent of foreign aid, would be languishing. But it's the other way around. Capital is not an initiating force, it comes, as economic historians have discovered, the early Industrial Revolution didn't depend on massive amounts of capital. The railway age did, but that was well into this. And to this day, you can start a firm. You don't have to have large amounts of capital. You can start and use trade capital. You can use your credit cards and get a whole bunch of them and start out that way, or you can get loans from your uncle, or you can use retained earnings, which is the way most companies go. So it's not capital, it's not institutions, it's entrepreneurship, it's innovation, although I don't much like the word innovation. I prefer trade-tested betterment. In the same way that the word capitalism turns us away from what's the key point here and makes us think that it's the accumulation of capital that makes us rich. That's wrong. It's ideas. And behind the idea, as I say in this book and try to prove, is the liberal egalitarian idea, equality before the law and equality of social dignity. Now, why did these come? These came because of certain concrete, actual accidents of European history. They didn't come from some deep European superiority. I expect sub-Saharan Africa in 50 or 100 years to have the income of Sweden. I don't see why that wouldn't happen. You'd have to be kind of some sort of racist to think otherwise. And so the whole world will become developed in the next 50 or 100 years, and we'll have the most glorious period of human flourishing in history if we don't screw it up, as we did in August of 1914. So let's try not to do that. The accidents were, I think of as the 4 R's. Here I'll conclude. The 4 R's are reading. The printing press was crucial here. It wasn't invented in Germany. It was invented in China, like practically everything else, up to 1600 and even up to 1700. Invented hundreds of years before in China. So it was reading, the first R. It was the Reformation, but not the way Max Weber viewed it, as this matter of the doctrine of salvation, but the matter of church governance. The well-named Congregationalists, the Puritans, the Reformed Church, chose their own ministers, unlike my Anglicans and your Lutherans, who still had a church hierarchy. The extreme example of this is in the 17th century, the English Quakers, who don't have a minister at all. They just sit around like this and wait for the Holy Spirit to descend. And the revolt, the Dutch revolt against Spain, the 80 Years' War, 80 years up to 1648, which succeeded. It's like Vietnam defeating the United States. The small country defeated the 16th century hegemon, Spain. And the revolutions in England in the 16th century, not so much 1688, which Doug North emphasizes, but the 1640s, the English Civil War, and then the great revolutions of the late 18th century in the United States and France. And those made people bold. Those made ordinary people think that they could have a go. And that's my theme. Ordinary people, I think it's the great hypothesis of 18th century liberal thought, from Voltaire to Mary Wollstonecraft. That's the hypothesis that ordinary people, if left alone, will do well, which was shown to be true in the 19th century, when ordinary people of various kinds were freed. So that's my tale. If you want to get economic growth, let entrepreneurs do their job. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those words. Very interesting and stimulating lecture. Now I'd like to ask the commentators up on stage. Regrettably, Colin had to leave for personal private matters, so there's only going to be 2 people speaking in the panel. But I'm sure
being cheated.
going to do a good job anyway. The speakers are John. I actually practiced ahead to get this right. Chisholm, as a Swede, Chisholm, but I was like, but Chisholm is a guy who knows what entrepreneurship is all about. He has been one himself. Presently, he is CEO of John Chisholm Ventures, a startup advisory and angel investing group. Welcome up. Second, we have Rosine Sally, who is some of an acquaintance of this circle, since he is, together with Fredrik Eriksson, founder of eSipe. He is now the associate professor of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore and chairman of the Institute of Policy Studies in Sri Lanka. We will start with John. The floor is yours.
Mina damer och herrar, jag glad att få vara här idag. Tack för inbjudan. Silicon Valley, my hometown, is the most prolific high-technology center in the world. On a per capita basis, Stockholm is number 2. What can Silicon Valley and Stockholm learn from each other? For the last 38 years, I've lived and worked in Silicon Valley, home to Apple, Google, Facebook, HP, Intel, Genentech, Salesforce, Twitter, Yelp, and many others. In these 38 years, I've worked for large and small companies alike, some of which have gone out of business, and founded, grown, and sold 2 software companies, co-founded a 3rd, and invested in others. I think there's a great deal we can learn from each other. Sweden is home of Spotify, Skype, king of Candy Crush fame, Mojang of Minecraft fame, the payment services Klarna, and many others. The population of Sweden is less than 10 million, about the same as New York City. So you think globally from the outset, something we need to do more of. I see a greater inclination for entrepreneurs and people in general to live more frugally in Sweden than in the United States, which provides a key source of funds for startups in the earliest stages. And the culture of incubators and accelerators, whereby startups can learn from each other, is well established here. Entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley, and I believe in Sweden as well, has arisen organically. In the case of Silicon Valley, over 8 decades. Silicon Valley was not designed or planned, nor could it have been. No one could predict that thousands of mobile app developers would arise for mobile devices, which in turn would arise from cell phones and popular 1990s handhelds like the Palm Pilot, which would evolve alongside the World Wide Web, laptops, and pagers, which would arise from local area networking in parallel with gene sequencing, and more. All of the seeds and soil that gave rise to mobile apps existed in the 1980s, yet no one predicted or could have predicted them. Even as late as 2003, no one could have predicted or did predict the incredible rise of Facebook, which was founded in 2004. I dare say the same was true of Skype and Spotify. Unpredictability is not specific to Silicon Valley and Stockholm. It is a feature of all innovation. The Santa Fe Institute in Santa Fe, New Mexico is a, is a world-leading research center that focuses on complex systems. Economies, the environment, the human brain, innovation, and common law are all examples of complex systems, meaning that order arises not by top-down design, but from the interactions of many agents, whether individuals, neurons, or companies. Negligible differences in initial conditions can give rise to large differences in outcomes, and if you try to control such systems, you get unintended consequences. So don't try to predict them and don't try to control them. Both Silicon Valley and Stockholm have multinationals, of course, but more importantly are the thousands of locally grown companies, large and small, which together form interconnected ecosystems. The U.S. has two top high-tech areas, Silicon Valley and Route 128 around Boston. In the 1980s, Silicon Valley overtook Route 128, which got started decades before Silicon Valley. Why? Silicon Valley has two world-class universities, Stanford and Berkeley, as does Boston, Harvard, and MIT. But while Route 128 was mainly populated with vertically integrated centralized companies like Digital, Honeywell, Wang, and Prime, computer companies that made everything from disk drives to CPUs, Silicon Valley companies were much more atomic. Silicon Valley had many separate companies making disk drives and terminals and operating software and microprocessors and disk controllers. So the competition and spontaneous order were more direct, more granular, and more intense. If an entrepreneur saw a need for a better disk controller or today a better mobile payment system, he or she could assemble a team to build and test a solution to satisfy that need. Boston's computer industry has long disappeared. Those centralized companies could not adapt when technology shifted from minis to desktops to PCs to laptops to mobile devices. In contrast, the more decentralized ecosystem in Silicon Valley was more resilient and could more readily adapt as market conditions change. If the vertically integrated computer companies of Route 128 could not survive, imagine how much less resilient government-authorized monopolies like railroads, postal services, and public utilities are. Insulated from market forces, such monopolies have no incentive to be innovative, cost-effective, or customer service-oriented. Hundreds of thousands of companies have been started in Silicon Valley over the decades. Most of them failed. Growth comes from the companies that survive and grow. These are a small minority of all the companies that are founded. It is not enough to have a few well-established anchor tenants to make an ecosystem. For a robust ecosystem, you need thousands of companies starting up, most of which will fail, and a few of which will succeed and grow large. So we've seen that 1, you cannot predict the winners in advance, and 2, you need a lot of startups, most of which will fail. So don't expect an arm of Sweden or the EU government in particular to choose winners. Even highly rewarded and experienced venture capitalists get only 1 or 2 investments out of 10 right. Especially with many political forces that lead them astray, governments cannot choose winners or losers. A notable example in the US is Solyndra, the solar energy company. Before Solyndra declared bankruptcy in 2011, the US Department of Energy and State of California together provided over $500 million of loans, none of which was recovered. Governments cannot even predict winning or losing technologies, much less specific products and services. As I wrote in Forbes 3 years ago, in 2010, the U.S. Joint Forces Command warned that, quote, by 2012, surplus oil production capacity could entirely disappear, unquote. Somehow, they missed the fracking revolution, which would hugely expand U.S. oil and gas production just 2 years later. Similarly, in 2011, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission and AT&T saw a looming crisis. Wireless was running out of spectrum. Somehow, they missed Wi-Fi, which would bypass and preserve the precious wireless spectrum, completely eliminating the crisis. Many trials, whether successes or failures, are also key to learning and ultimately to success in Silicon Valley. Each attempt is a learning experiment for the entrepreneur. If you don't try to satisfy what you think is a customer need, you never discover where real customer needs lie. As a result, having one or more failures before you first succeed is very likely. Having worked for at least one failed startup is so common, it's just no big deal. Here's a question and a challenge for Sweden. How might the same mindset and culture be widely adopted here and more generally in Europe? So that is the benefit of failures. Regarding successes, everyone has heard of the huge IPOs like Google and Facebook, but for every very visible liquidity event like those are hundreds of much smaller liquidity events. Together, the few large liquidity events, which might benefit hundreds of employees, and the many smaller liquidity events, which each might benefit a single founder or handful of co-founders, spread wealth very broadly across the region. Silicon Valley is the ultimate anti-poverty program. Such events have further given rise to both major venture capital firms and tens of thousands of smaller scale angel investors, all of whom help launch the next cohort of startups and complete the positive feedback loop. My sense is that Stockholm is just beginning to enjoy this virtuous cycle. So those are factors that contribute to Silicon Valley and Stockholm's entrepreneurial successes. In my experience, the biggest obstacle to entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley, and I suspect in Stockholm as well, is regulation. In most respects, starting a company today is easier than it has been in the past, thanks to technology. Software has become more functional and smarter. Many services and technical courses are available free online. Just one thing has made starting a business harder, and that's government regulation. One small example. Over half of U.S. states now require a license to braid hair. In some cases, braiders, many of them young black women who can ill afford the expense, must take irrelevant courses costing thousands of dollars. Many potential entrepreneurs, especially those with few skills and resources, are being blocked, and the numbers blocked are growing each decade. They block the very men and women in society who find it hardest to find work and provide for their families in self-sufficient dignity. Still, other regulations disallow life-saving drugs. Such regulations do not improve quality of life. They generate revenue for governments and protect politically important lobbies from competition. Let's see graphically the effects of imposed regulations. Say that 10 years ago, in some aspect of your life, perhaps your personal health or the airspace above and around your home, what you were allowed to do by law was bounded by these new regulations. Now fast forward 10 years to the present. Regulations stay fixed while advances in knowledge, technology, and cooperation enable more dimensions of human needs to be satisfied that the regulations also preclude. During that time, perhaps, innovation has enabled intelligent drones, or Uber and Lyft crowdsourced taxi services, or neurogaming helmets with sensors that detect your emotional state and incorporate it into gameplay. What had previously been a single dimension of possibilities excluded by regulation is now many dimensions of human needs whose satisfaction is disallowed by those same regulations. But these figures oversimplify the situation. The actual situation is far worse. The regulations are not clear, flat boundaries between what is allowed and disallowed, but irregular and complex surfaces. The longer, more complex and subjective the regulation, the more irregular, complex, and blurry the surfaces. These surfaces take more time and money to explore and comprehend, and impart more advantage to the well-funded and well-connected. Creating ever more complex laws to block loopholes is not the solution. That only further advantages the well-funded, connected, and influential who can afford the best legal counsel and win exemptions. The only sustainable solution is fewer, simpler, and less obtrusive laws. Yes?
You only have a couple of minutes left.
Okay. All right, great. I'm almost done. Over 100,000 health and fitness apps compete today, but only few choices. Why? Because these areas are more regulated. And if even a fraction of those companies and entrepreneurs could address the opportunities in these other areas, these other fields and humanity would see much more faster advance today. The easy, popular, and ineffective way to deal with this is through such techniques as business plan competitions and elevator pitch competitions and immediate short-term incentives. I call these entrepreneurship theater. Instead, we have to address the real problem, which is making tax environments more attractive than anywhere else in the world so that entrepreneurs want to come here rather than elsewhere, and making regulation as light as possible. And in the book I offer, the problem is difficult because the most egregious regulations vary from region to region and from industry to industry. So there is no single silver bullet. And there are just a lot of things that we need to work on in parallel, and the book offers a bunch of these. To give, I'll skip that one. To give full credit to Sweden. Sweden is number 8 on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index, only one spot below the United States. But any of us can improve. And here we see that Sweden was number 9 last year, is number 8 this year. That's good. Sweden has moved up. These are the areas that contribute to that and the areas in which Sweden can potentially improve. Here's an aggressive goal. In 5 years, make it a goal to cut Sweden's rank in half from 8 to 4. In summary, to further advance entrepreneurial ecosystems in Sweden and the EU, recognize that they cannot be designed and that the winners and losers cannot be predicted, especially by governments. Focus instead on creating the right climate and environment, attractive taxes and unobtrusive regulation, trust in freedom and free markets. Nothing less than freedom and the continued flourishing of Sweden and the EU is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those kind words. Rosine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frederick. Well, first let me say it's a pleasure to be back here after a few years at Timbro. I think the first time I came here was 14 years ago, and of course ESIPE was through Frederick Eriksson was an outgrowth of Timbro. And it's nice to be surrounded by lots of Nordic design again. Well, I have some pretty brief observations to make on the two keywords of this panel, which are jobs and entrepreneurship. And I want to talk about jobs and entrepreneurship in Europe by reference to Asia and what lessons there are from Asia or parts of Asia for Europe. Let me explain why I do this in a roundabout way. I left Europe about 5 years ago and moved to Singapore. So I spent most of my time in Asia, in Singapore and in my native Sri Lanka. I don't look Sri Lankan. I may sound more British than anything else to you, but I happen to be half Sri Lankan. So my acquaintance with the world of policies and regulation is much more Asia than Europe these days. So I will look at jobs and entrepreneurship through an Asian mirror. jobs and entrepreneurship are two different but related things. So by the jobs agenda, I'm thinking of employment creation generally, whatever jobs are created, whether they're unskilled, low-skilled, mid-skilled, or high-skilled. Entrepreneurship, Deirdre and John have talked a lot about. I don't want to go into that. But to begin with, I look at entrepreneurship very much in a Schumpeterian sense. It is about the agent, the entrepreneur, who innovates. So I will, if you'll excuse me, just use the word innovation for a while. And by that, Schumpeter meant, very simply, taking new ideas and bringing them to market by doing new and different things through a process of creative destruction. So it's very much about the enabling environment for that kind of entrepreneurship to take place. And of course, that kind of entrepreneurship produces better skilled, higher paying, more stimulating jobs than just any old job. That's the difference between jobs per se and entrepreneurship for jobs. Now, my starting point is that Europe is clearly doing badly and worse on both fronts, on the jobs front as well as on the entrepreneurship front. Now, of course, Europe is big and varied. There are some pockets of Europe that are doing relatively better. So that's true of Britain and other parts of Northwestern and North Europe, and one can think of the Baltics in Eastern Europe. But then most of the rest of Europe is much worse, particularly the large countries in the south and some in the east as well, where you do have not just high unemployment, but particularly high youth unemployment. And most of Europe, in fact, is stuck or stagnant when it comes to entrepreneurship in the sense that I've defined it or explained it simply. Particularly if you compare it with the United States. Now, the real problem in Europe is low productivity and little innovation in the services sector in particular. And we are talking of countries that, as economists would put it, are somewhere close to the frontier, as it were. These are rich, mature economies. They need productivity growth because they can't mobilize inputs like labor and capital just to engineer fast catch-up growth. And that productivity growth is supposed to come through innovation. Well, services continue to be innovated by entrepreneurial companies in the United States. And breakthrough services, breakthrough companies, Facebook, Google, and so on, not accidentally, come from the United States because you have a much more entrepreneurial economy for that kind of innovation and wealth creation. A classic example I give to my students is that of Nokia. Nokia, of course, was one of the big European success stories in manufacturing. But Nokia remained a manufacturing company. It never developed a services ecosystem around it the way Apple did in the United States. And that is a reflection of the European economy that Nokia was and is embedded in. So what lessons from Asia for Europe? Well, Asia is an ancient Greek construct. It's everything to the east of ancient Greece, putting Europe and Africa to one side. Okay? So it is large, it's very difficult to generalize, of course. The Asia that I'm familiar with is not so much Central Asia or North Asia or the Middle East. It's more globalizing Asia, which is East Asia and South Asia. So it's from India and the rest of South Asia through the middle of Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, to Greater China and Northeast Asia, and you could add Australia and New Zealand going further down. These are four different types of economies. You have rich Asia, which is the Northeast Asian pocket, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, plus the city-states of Hong Kong and Singapore. You have middle-income Asia, which is 3 countries, China now, astonishingly so, given where it started, plus Malaysia and Thailand, per capita incomes of between $8,000 to $15,000 a year. Then you have low middle-income Asia, which is a populous bulk, including India, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, and my own Sri Lanka. And then you have really poor Asia, actually not that populous these days. Countries like Nepal, Cambodia, Laos, East Timor. Now, back to jobs and back to jobs. There are good examples and there are really bad examples. So let me give you some really bad examples, which are obviously examples to avoid. Think of India, not just under the license Raj, but India today. And here we're talking of a low middle income country. India has something on the statute books called the Industrial Disputes Act, which goes back to 1947. In other words, it actually started under the British. And then Mrs. Gandhi ratcheted it up with one provision, which is still on the statute books. If you are a company that employs 100 or more people, you have to apply for permission to the Labor Department of your state government to fire even one person. Right. There's an infamous example of someone from Bharat Forge, which is belongs to one of the big Indian kind of business houses, who was dismissed for sleeping on the job, quite literally, in 1984. The company actually managed to get rid of him about 3 or 4 years ago. In other words, he continued to sleep on the job for an extra 20 plus years. Now, what's the effect of that kind of regulation? It's prevented India from having an East Asian style industrial revolution, because companies either remain very small, cottage industries, or some of the big ones employ capital and technology, but not unskilled labor from the countryside and put them into work in jobs in the cities. Which is why India hasn't had the kind of growth and prosperity that China has had. 90%, more than 90%, it's close to 95% of Indians who work in the so-called informal or unorganized economy. In other words, they have no legal protections. They're stuck in low wages, low productivity jobs. Right. That's the effect of this kind of regulation. Now, the better examples come from East Asia. The East Asian miracle, the catch-up growth of the East Asian tigers ending with China, is due to many things about getting the basics right. But one of those getting the basics right was to have flexible labor markets. Yes, in some cases, unions were forcibly suppressed, as in South Korea. But flexible labor markets means you're open to both entry and exit. Right? Without that, they wouldn't have had catch-up growth. Right? So the lesson there, I think, is very simple. You need labor markets with ease of entry and exit. And another thing from the East Asian miracle economies, they maintained, and still maintain more or less, reasonably small welfare states, where you do target the really needy, but you don't create middle-class entitlements. Right. Now, the best examples come from the city-states of Hong Kong and Singapore. I live in Singapore, so let me give you the Singaporean example here. You have very flexible labor markets. Employers, local and foreign, are able to hire and fire. And that, combined with a welfare state that it exists, but it's very basic and it's very well targeted, creates the incentives for productive work. And I think Singapore offers very good an example of labor market regulation, welfare state regulation, that I think should be studied a lot more over here. Another thing about Singapore, the welfare state in Singapore, well, let me put it another way. The provision of things like pensions, healthcare, unemployment insurance is funded in Singapore. It's almost fully funded because it comes from private accounts. So you don't have that kind of build-up of a stock of unfunded debt that you have in Europe. Let me now end with the entrepreneurship issue. Here, the lessons are not from Asia, because most countries in Asia have the kind of institutions that were congruent with catch-up growth. Catch-up growth you can do under different political systems, even with a lot of corruption, providing the corruption is reasonably predictable, right, and the price isn't too high. But the rich economies of Asia and the middle-income economies in Asia are stuck because they haven't actually moved from perspiration to inspiration, to quote Paul Krugman. They haven't moved to.
Edison.
And Paul Krugman borrowed
He borrowed it,
from Edison.
as he borrows everything.
So we have institutions in Asia that simply haven't adapted or transformed themselves to nurture this kind of innovation-led growth. Why? Because political systems remain closed, highly illiberal. Because societies remain closed or semi-closed. They haven't become open societies in the full plural sense. And because regulation stifles not just products but factor markets. This is crucial. Unless you liberate not just the product markets but the markets for factors, for labor, land and capital, you're not going to have a truly innovative society. This is the real challenge in Asia. And the politics or the political economy of liberalizing your banking system, property rights in the countryside, and even your labor markets, that's a bigger challenge than simply liberalizing products. So when it comes to entrepreneurship, I don't think Europe has much to learn from Asia in the round. And the lesson here, I think, is very clear. To move from imitation to innovation, to real entrepreneurship, that kind of creative destruction, you need a combination of plural open societies, liberal institutions, which, yes, does mean democracy. Right? I don't think there's any way around that when you get to a mature stage. And then finally, regulatory reforms that go beyond the initial phase of liberalizing products to liberalizing factors, land, labor, and capital. Thank you.
Deirdre, do you want to rejoin the panel?
Certainly.
Do any of the speakers, commentators, have any comments on each other?
Well, I just say that my colleagues are extremely insightful and correct because they agree with me. Pretty much. So let's move to the audience. They have more interesting things to ask.
Questions? Wait for the mic, please, and please state your name and any affiliation.
Thank you. I'm Fabian Midman. I just want to know, how do you foresee the future of robotics? Thank you.
Of what?
Robotics.
We mustn't be frightened by the word. It's
Workforce.
What?
Workforce.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, that we'll lose jobs and we'll all be idle. And it hasn't happened yet. Some of my colleagues in economics have, over the centuries, said that new tools would cause people to be unemployed. And it's not the tools that make them unemployed, it's rules like that you can't fire someone in a large company that make them unemployed. Robots are tools. There's a marvelous scene in Ibsen's, let's see now, which one is it? Not The Master Builder. The one about the shipyard magnate. What's his name? No, Enemy of the People, I think it is. No, that's another one. Anyway, there's a scene, the theme in that, the sub-theme in that play is that the workers resist the installation of machines because that will result in lost work. And that's, people think this way. And it's not true. Yes, people, look, I've been to the Volvo factory outside of Gothenburg, and there's enormous robots tirelessly doing this all day, and a man with a clipboard and a white coat standing, examining dials and no one else in the factory, not quite, but close. But those people go to other jobs. If that were not so, if better machines, a wheel is a machine, a shovel is a machine, they're all machines. If machines made us unemployed, most of us would be unemployed. Yes. We'd have 90% unemployment.
There is a trend going on. A century ago, we worked 6.5 hours a day, days a week. Then it was 6, then it was 5.5, then it was 5, then it was 4.5, whatever it is now. So we're not living at a lower standard of living today than we were a century ago, because despite the fact that we're only working 70 or 80% as many hours, we're living much better than we did. That trend will continue, and robots will accelerate it.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it may well be that in 50 years we're only working 2 or 3 days a week.
Sounds good to me.
But so I worry a bit that the whole focus on jobs is somewhat misplaced. What we should be worried about is quality of life, overall quality of life, which includes leisure time. If we can, I see that it's getting in. My classmate and friend, Larry Summers, says the cost of virtually every non-politically inflected product category has declined over the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. Cars, electronics, furniture, you name it. Anything that's not politically inflected, as he calls it, that is, things that are controlled, like housing and healthcare and food. These are going up. But if you just leave things to the market, the prices will come down, and it'll require less and less money to live, and we'll be able to have more and more leisure time. So that's a thought.
Zine.
Yes. On robotics, I think you'll get a good answer from a book that's going to come out in a few months by Fredrik Eriksson and Bjorn Weigel, precisely on this issue of modern inventions and what they mean for jobs, among other things. I think new inventions with old regulations might turn out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So Klaus Schwab and lots of economists who worry about a so-called fourth industrial revolution leading to wholesale job killing, that might come about if these new ideas, instead of existing in open systems, are stifled by all sorts of regulation, and the system becomes closed. But if you have more competition, it does boil down to more competition, and competition opened up in areas where stifling regulation exists, particularly in services markets, where there is a lot of government provision, where often the government has a monopoly or a near monopoly of finance and provision. If you open up those areas, then the chances are, as history has shown, that these inventions will spread into innovations that will be employment rich.
Sure.
That I don't think is rocket science.
No, I don't think so either.
No questions. Can I?
Are there any other
I want to ask one question
Go ahead.
to you. But my last book was called The New Equality: Global Development from Robin Hood to Botswana, where I'm arguing exactly like you do, like it was a revolution in equality that made the modern world.
Yes. Oh, good.
But it's institutional equality. And so I'm going with the Acemoglu Robinson Douglas North thing, arguing that there were institutional changes in England and in the Netherlands that laid the ground for this.
I don't think so.
Can you make a case against it? I haven't read your book yet, so I'm not.
Well, you know, you got the whole summer to do it. I don't know why I haven't started. Over out in the countryside in your red shack, you can do it. I don't think so. My understanding of say the period from 1600 Well, let's do a full Douglas North. Let's start with 1688, or start with 1685 and go forward. My claim is that down to 1832, there are essentially no institutional inventions in Britain. None at all. The common law, the law of property, contracts, whatever you can name, don't change. The educational system doesn't change. The name an institution, the church doesn't change. Nothing changes. That's including the glorious revolution itself. Acemoglu, Robinson, Doug North, all my friends who are new institutionalists, Avner Greif, as I argue in the books, are probably wrong. It's not institutions. Look, most institutions are extremely conservative. The universities in England in the 18th century, as Adam Smith eloquently said, were terrible conservative institutions for the employment of the fellows of the colleges. So no, I don't think so. I think the institutions start changing rapidly in England, at least, after 1832.
Okay. Doug North talks about informal institutions and formal institutions, and you seem to focus on the formal part.
Yeah,
but
but look,
aren't the informal institutions pretty much the same as your ideas?
Yeah, but then he should call them ideas instead of informal institutions. Look, if you, here's what Doug does or did, and he was a splendid man and a marvelous scholar, but by the way, he didn't get the Nobel Prize for New Institutionalism.
No.
How do I know? I wrote the citation. So let's get that aside. But in any case,
On that point,
yeah.
maybe the difference between the two perspectives is the institutional perspective is essentially static.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And the ideas perspective is essentially dynamic.
I completely agree.
Because it's the ideas that are driving the changes and evolution of the institutions.
That's right. That's right. It's ideas. It's ethical change. It's the habits of the lip. It's ideology. We can use my childhood Marxism. It's that those are where the change happens. And if you want to call them informal institutions and wave at them the way Doug did, and say, well, it's informal institutions. Avner Greif does the same thing. Then you've just made a tautology. Mine is very specific, particular ideas that the origin of which I talk about. I'm not saying I'm the only person who has any thoughts on these matters, but I do believe that neo-institutionalism is misleading. In the case of the World Bank, it's become orthodoxy. And the orthodoxy at the World Bank now is add institutions and stir.
Okay, there's one last question there, probably. Oh, there's...
Let's
Okay,
go a
hello.
little further. There are a couple more. I'll be more brief.
All right. Thank you for discussing these subjects. It's very interesting. I've been thinking a bit about them. I don't really know how to formulate my question, but I'm finding it very interesting. The digital era we live in now, how that affect productivity, and
Here's the expert.
and I've lived in the emerging market or the frontier market in Africa for a while, and I see what happened in Kenya the last couple of years, and corruption is of course a major issue there, but they have something called M-Pesa, which is a digital payment system. Just by your phone, you don't even have to have your own smartphone. You can have an old phone there. I'm thinking about how to create jobs for nations like Kenya with your digital idea of productivity, and do you have any ideas about this? How will I heard very positive ideas about the next 50 and 100 years from now. Everything will bloom and be very positive thanks to productivity shift upwards thanks to the new technology. But what do you foresee in the future?
Well, one of the things that gives me optimism is the fact that learning is becoming so broadly distributed and readily accessible, learning of technical skills around the world. And I'm referring to all the new online services as one example of many of which are free of charge. You see them, edX and MITx from Harvard and MIT, Coursera, Udacity, Code Academy, which teaches programming skills to anyone. It used to require tens of thousands of dollars and being accepted to an institution of higher learning in order to get the opportunity for education. Now all it takes is initiative and hard work. Those are not going to go away. But for those who are willing to invest the initiative and hard work, even in Kenya, even in Mongolia, we see kids taking the engineering courses that MIT offers online. Some of them are being accepted to MIT. And there's kind of an inversion happening. It used to be you applied to a higher university and then the university found out how well you did. Now you do the work in advance, or increasingly in the future, it will be you demonstrate that you can do the work by taking the online courses, and for the ones who perform the best, those are the ones who are invited to go to the residential university, the elite university. So anyway, I'm for those who are willing to work hard and apply themselves and have passion and perseverance about what they're doing, which is incidentally the title of the first chapter of my book, Passion and Perseverance, a Positive Feedback Loop. Those folks will have more opportunities than they have in the past.
Now we're talking about mostly...
Hold it closer, dear. We won't be able to hear you.
Okay. We're talking about capitalism without capitalist and more equal entrepreneurship. But can it really become a reality? Because whenever the entrepreneurship is driving a society for growth, there is always profit is there. So how is it that is, if you are keeping the government aside, so how are we going to handle that situation? And like, for example, Singapore, the government is involved in everything, most of the things.
Yeah, but there's entry, which is the real protection for ordinary people. And it's the source of employment and look. Bill Nordhaus, an economist at Harvard, did a study of the percentage of the social gain that comes from an innovation that's retained by the inventor, and it turns out to be 2%. 98% ends up in the hands of consumers or wage earners. It's not the case that once there's an innovation, they just get richer and richer. It's not true that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Global inequality has been falling like a stone in the last 30 years.
That's an perfect end note, I think. So give her a round of applause. Thank you so much for coming to Sweden, and thank you much for coming to Timbro. Now we have some wine and mingle outside.